Our team coverage continues now with a look at how the recent assassination attempt on former president and current Republican nominee Donald Trump fits in political history. Western Mass News reporter Wesley Days is live in studio after his conversation with a local history professor on the topic. Wesley, John Back says this latest incident of politically charged violence is certainly unique.
It absolutely is, Abby, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But how does a wave of political violence like this impact us legally? Could laws change how rallies like these are now presented to the public? Listen to what Back has to say.
It seems likely that a change of practice, but not a change of law, will take place.
Insights on insurrection. This time we're not talking about events like January 6, 2021, but our country's history with assassinations of elected leaders. Western New England University's John Back walks us through the dark spots of our democracy.
The simple, terrible truth is that being the president of the United States or being someone running for president of the United States is a very dangerous job. Of course, the case of two Kennedys, one sitting president running again, and one brother trying to be the nominee in 1968, both were killed. We have also had Abraham Lincoln's presidency famously ended early because of an assassin's bullet.
There's even an incident a century ago that's an eerie reminder of Saturday's events.
But the circumstances of this one, if not exactly unique, Teddy Roosevelt was actually running. He was president, he stepped down, he came back again. He was actually shot during a campaign appearance.
He says there may not be a legal impact.
But this is not going to mean a change in the laws. That would be a very, very difficult thing to see. The Secret Service can't impose, it can only recommend.
But incidents like these are certainly a wake-up call.
Perhaps the former president scales back the rallies. Perhaps he does something that makes the Secret Service detail more comfortable.
All right, let's break this down a little bit more. Only time will tell what Saturday's assassination attempt means for the future of what a Trump rally as we know it will now look like in the future. Trump's focus right now is in Milwaukee as the RNC continues tonight, as you saw our coverage just a few minutes ago. Now, speaking of the convention, Abby, we're getting reaction to the biggest news that's come out of Wisconsin so far. We're talking about J.D. Vance. He's the former president's pick for vice president. You don't want to miss what residents in this area have to say about that in a little under an hour from now at 6. Reporting live in studio, Wesley Days, Western Mass News.